Hi, everyone. We're just letting people come into the Zoom space. We'll get started in just a bit. Give us a few more seconds to let everyone come in. Hello, hi. We have a lot of people signed up for this one, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds so that people don't miss anything. Alrighty. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started, and then people can come in as they do. Hi, my name is Brittany Kerfoot, the Director of Events for Politics and Prose Bookstore in DC, and I'd like to welcome you all to this PNP Live event. I am so excited to be moderating this because Lolita was a formative text for me in becoming a writer myself. And actually, I have a rescue cat named Humbert because he is, in fact, the absolute worst. So the name is very fitting for him. I'm going to go over just a couple of items before we start the talk. First, I'm going to drop a link in the chat very soon where you can purchase a copy of tonight's book straight from PNP's website. And we offer shipping to anywhere in the US, but if you live in the DC area, you can actually pick up your copy from any of our 3 store locations around the district. Also, if you would like to ask any of our speakers a question, please enter it in the Q&A space, which is found at the bottom of your screen. And we ask that you put your questions there instead of in the chat because they can kind of get lost. And we will get to the Q&A in the later portion of the event. All right, it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's program. Over 60 years ago, Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita was published in the United States to immediate controversy, but it was also a quick bestseller. Central to countless issues at the forefront of our national discourse, art and politics, race, gender, power, sexual trauma, Lolita still lives on now in the afterlife. This book features original contributions from a stellar cast of prominent 21st century writers, many of whom are here on your screen tonight. So our speakers tonight include Minton Quigley, the series editor for the Best Short Stories of the Year, the O. Henry Prize winners, and the author of the memoir, The Early Birds. She is the daughter of Walter J. Minton, the former president and publisher of J.P. Putnam's Sons, who first published Lolita back in 1958. Roxane Gay is the author of the best-selling books Bad Feminists, Difficult Women, and Hunger, among other titles. She is also the author of Black Panther, World of Wakanda for Marvel, and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Victor LaValle is the author of 7 works of fiction and 1 comic book, including his most recent novel, The Changeling. His writing has appeared in publications like The New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and the Paris Review. He currently teaches creative writing at Columbia University. Cheryl Strayed is the author of #1 best-selling memoir, Wild, as well as bestsellers Tiny Beautiful Things and Brave Enough, and the novel Torch. Wild was chosen by Oprah Winfrey as her first selection ever for Oprah's Book Club 2.0, and it was adapted into an Oscar-nominated film starring Reese Witherspoon. She is currently the host of the New York Times podcast, Sugar Calling. And finally, Alexander Chee, who is not here yet, but he will be joining us later in the evening. He is a novelist and essayist, most recently the author of the essay collection, How to Write an Autobiographical Novel. He is an editor-at-large for VQR, a critic-at-large for the LA Times, and an associate professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth. So please help me welcome this superstar lineup of authors onto your screens. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for being here. So let's dive in. I'll pose the first question to you, Jenny. So you have a personal history with the publication of Lolita, a family history, actually. And so can you tell us a little bit about that and also how this project came to be in general?
Yes. So my father published Lolita, but I have to back up a tiny bit to get there, which is that my grandfather was the son of a fisherman in Red Bank, New Jersey. And at 15 years old, he went to make his way in the world. And he got on a ferry in New Jersey to go to New York. But instead of getting off at Wall Street, where he planned to interview with Standard Oil, instead he got off in Midtown and walked into Scribner's and Son, Charles Scribner's and Son, a publisher, and got hired into the stockroom. So I'm going to speed it up, but he worked there for a whole bunch of years. And he worked there for a whole bunch of years. He made his way up, moved over to Putnam's, and then George Putnam left Putnam's in near bankruptcy to go find his wife, Amelia Earhart. So our fortunes changed when he went to find Amelia Earhart, and my grandfather was able to take over the company in bankruptcy and with a partner. So he was like a very old-fashioned, even though he hadn't even been educated, he went on to publish these memoirs by Teddy Roosevelt and by the Duke of Windsor. And he died early of a stroke. And my father, at a very young age, he had started working in the company, but was not very far along. He took over Putnam's, and he had, my voice sounds nervous. He had a totally different idea, a radical idea of how he wanted to run the company. It was 1955. It was the Eisenhower era. And McCarthyism, a whole bunch of publishers and writers had been prosecuted. And my father was brash and young and bold, and he went after Norman Mailer, and there was a book called The Deer Park that no one would publish. And then he heard about Nabokov. He heard that there was this book called Lolita that no one would publish, that Viking said, we'll all go to jail, that all 5 major houses had turned down. And so he wrote to Nabokov up in Ithaca. He said something like, being a backward publisher from the backwards Americans, I've recently heard about this book and I'd like to come see you about it. He flew on this DC-3 in the middle of a storm, which my mom always told us about, like it was Casablanca or something. He landed in Ithaca, and he negotiated a contract to publish Lolita, which had been in a small printing over in France, published by Gerodius, the Olympia Press. And Nabokov wasn't happy with it. There were a whole bunch of typos in it. It was a small printing. They'd had a falling out, but my father had to negotiate between the parties to publish Lolita, and there you go. It was published. It sold 100,000 copies in 3 weeks. It hit the bestseller list. They ran ads saying, "This is the book everybody was scared to bring you." And here we are now, 65 years later, still talking about it.
That's good marketing. Just play to everyone's morbid curiosity.
So how we'd market it today.
Right. So what made you want to put this collection together, and why now specifically?
2 reasons. One is my mother. Everybody says, the Hamilton line, like, who lives, who dies, who tells your story. My mother, I'm gonna get like all choked up, and she's not even on this. but my mother, she really wanted my father's story told. She kept sending these articles to the New York, these little letters to the New York Times, and finally a friend of ours, Rand Richards Cooper, came over and interviewed my dad and put a piece in the New York Times in the talk of the town about him. And then my friend Jen Marshall and I were having lunch, and a piece by Caitlin Flanagan had just come out in the Atlantic, in which she said, let us now reread the old texts, examining them with a cold eye to determine what they reveal about the Me Too transgressions of the artistic past. Is nothing safe? Perhaps, and at Vegas odds, only Lolita can survive the new cultural revolution. And as we talked about it, we realized that the bookshop the movie was playing, in which a bookseller sells Lolita in England despite the ban. Andre Dubus was writing in the New York Times Book Review about reading it for the first time and being torn in two. And we sort of thought, this is the moment to re-examine this book. And then I was so lucky that this brilliant cast of writers that I never in my wildest dreams imagined would sign on for this project did. It was just incredible. So grateful.
Yeah, I want to ask you about all of the contributors later, but first I would like to just kind of go around the room for each of you and get a quick summary about your particular piece that you contributed in the collection, and also maybe tell us how you first encountered Lolita, if you remember, and how you felt about it. Roxane, I love how you say that Lolita is, quote, a book you love and hate in equal measure. So with that, can we start with you?
Certainly. I don't remember when I first read Lolita, but I was probably a teenager, and I loved it, and I was appalled, not appalled actually, just like repulsed by it, because Humbert was so viscerally loathsome. And I always marveled at that ability for a writer to make me love and hate something in equal measure, because I think it's a real skill. And I think Nabokov is brilliant, and I think Lolita is brilliant. And so my essay actually looks at the challenges or the tension of writing beautifully about ugly things, and how a really good writer can negotiate that tension. And also, I looked a little bit toward the end at the marketing of Lolita, because we always see, especially in film, we see Humbert as a handsome, attractive guy, and that, I think, makes us more open to tolerating his nonsense and his crimes. He doesn't look, for example, like Woody Allen. And, I think that's interesting. And all of the book covers show a coquettish 12-year-old, 13-year-old girl, or there are lips that are bright red. There are all of these phallic images. And so, it's all very tantalizing. And I think that there's a lot to interrogate there.
Victor, how about you? Do you remember when you first read it?
I do, and I'm maybe embarrassed to admit, it wasn't until graduate school that I read it. And the way it came about was essentially I was in a writing class, and we had our professor. I don't want to say who it was in case he wouldn't want me saying this, but one of the students had a reference in the book to the famous parenthetical picnic lightning, and the professor said, I enjoyed that reference to Lolita. And then all of us in the room, I think, or just about all of us, just crickets. And and then he was horrified that none of us had read it. And he yelled at us for about 15 minutes saying, I don't understand how you think you're adults who plan to be writers in English and you have not read Lolita. And he just chewed us out to no end. And it was one of the best lessons I ever got in graduate school, right? Which was just like, you need to know this. And so then I went and read the book, and I think admired it more than loved it, right? But was amazed by the sort of magic trick of it, right? And that was how I kind of first came to Lolita. And my essay, interestingly, maybe is on the opposite spectrum, is telling a personal story about when I was in my early years of teaching college, and I had a fantastically handsome student in my class. Like the kind of person who walks in the room, you just go, that's a Cary Grant, like that kind of handsome, right? And the way that I saw that we all gave him, all the students and me, even the teacher, gave him so much more room and rope and benefit of the doubt. And it took so much longer for us to understand that he was actually an awful, awful person, in part because he was such a physically beautiful man, right? And physically beautiful in a different way than than he's depicted in the movies. Much more sort of rugged and thinking about, and then so my essay is about taking that kind of masculine beauty that is not only handsome, but also sort of aggressive, and thinking that on some level is what Nabokov was depicting in his book, or at least my image of him. And that was part of what made him such a disturbing character, was the idea that kind of handsomeness, that Cary Grant handsomeness, could be used to hide so much kind of ugliness and evil in a way that even other kinds of masculine beauty would not hide it. And so that's so my essay was about like how I essentially got fooled by my Humbert when I was a teacher, and how long it took me to sort of assert that, like, you got to calm down, you're bad news. And it took a while.
Wow. Cheryl, yours is not exactly an essay. It's more like a short story from the point of view of Dolores Hayes' Lolita. Can you tell us about what inspired you to write that?
Yeah. So I first read Lolita in the summer of 1995 when I was hiking the Pacific Crest Trail. So in my book, Wild, I actually write about reading Lolita and doing with Lolita what I did with all the books, or most of the books that I carried on my hike, which is I burned them page by page to lighten my load. And I had, the reaction that I think so many of us had to the book when we first read it. What a brilliant, unbelievably brilliant writer. What a sort of riveting read, and yet how awful, and how can I be compelled by this character? I was always sort of disturbed by that. And really the idea to write this short story started with Jenny, who approached me and said, when she asked me to contribute to this anthology, she said, I would love to hear what advice Sugar would have for Lolita. And so I started to really try to do like, dear Lolita, let me set you straight. And what I realized is that just wasn't working for me. Like, I didn't have any wisdom to offer this young girl who had been a victim of sexual violence. And what ended up happening is I realized, I went back and read Lolita again when I was writing my piece, and I had forgotten this piece in the beginning that's like the prologue that's sort of introducing the book, saying, listen, we found the diaries of this man, Humbert or whatever he is. And they mention in passing that the Lolita in question, the Dolores Hayes, actually died in childbirth. They call her, they don't even call her by her name. They call her Mrs. Richard Schiller, died in childbirth, basically on her 18th birthday, or near her 18th birthday. And I just thought, well, what if that was wrong? What if they got that piece of information wrong? What if actually Dolores lived and waited all these years to actually tell her story? And so instead of me as Sugar writing to her, I had her write a letter to Sugar. And the conceit is that nobody will read this anyway, because at that point I had stopped writing the Dear Sugar column. So she's saying, listen, I read your column. She's a very literate woman. She's read all these books, and I've read your column, and I'm going to send you this essentially my own confession, which is the confession of my survival, the confession of my revising the story. In fact, having completely lived a story that was never told of me, I'm going to tell it now. I'm going to make this story myself, essentially, is what she says to me. So it is a short story. It's not an essay. Even I got so into it as writing, like as if she were a real person writing to Sugar, that I kept having to remind myself, no, this is fiction. Like, this isn't actually Dolores writing to me. This is I'm writing a fictional character. And so I sort of, she got to live beyond Lolita in my piece, and I had so much fun doing it.
She actually got to.
I just have to jump in for 1 second here to say that when Cheryl's piece came in is when I had this realization that not only is Lolita art, but this book is art. And everyone who has read it has said, oh my gosh, like we hear Lolita's voice finally. And not only does she give Humbert one sentence and the letter H, she calls him H, but she introduces all these characters, Mavis and Betsy, right? Who are the friends who take Dolores under her wing. And instead of Dolores Hayes, he gave her a fictional name. She's actually Dolores Mays, which is just brilliant. And it's so beautifully written. And one thing that to give a shout out to, she's now an assistant editor at Vintage, Ellie Pritchett, because at first I had it at the very beginning of the book, to open up with. And Ellie said, I think this would come as such a reprieve. Like, we have Humbert and Humbert. We're so sick of Humbert. And that's exactly what happens. You hit the middle of the book and it's Lolita's voice. It's just beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, I loved being able to say, she's speaking from her wisdom and her age. And she's had this daughter who, who also, it's like she died in childbirth, who also didn't have a life. She had this daughter, Charlotte, who she named after her mother. And so the legacy of these women is brought forward, beyond the book. In my world, at least, in my fictional world. But I hope we can find a way to believe it's true, because I do think that is one of the great tragedies of Lolita, as beautiful and powerful and amazing as it is it's a fabulous story about the total destruction of women. So my piece was an answer to that. That says they lived.
Yeah, it actually says, you see that in allowing that poor girl to be dead, that Lolita, that Dolly, that Dolores Hayes, I let myself live. In setting her ablaze, I'd set myself free. I was never the story he made of me. I made it myself. And I mean, I could read the whole story out loud here, but also it reminded me, Cheryl, I had remembered that you had burned Lolita in Wild. I'd remembered that, and then she and Betsy and Mavis, and I don't want to ruin this story for everyone who's going to read it, but they have quite a bit of a bonfire also. But it reminded me too that Nabokov burned Lolita. Nabokov burned the manuscript of Lolita, and Vera, and Stacy writes about this in her essay. Vera rescued it from the fire. So it really is just, an on fire kind of book.
Yeah. Well, and I had forgotten I burned Lolita until I was like, I'd written like 2 drafts of this piece. And then I was like, wait a minute, I burned it too. So, I have Dolores burn it, and then but I had also burned it. Yeah. So there's sadly, a lot of book burning in this book that's in so many ways about not censoring writers. Sorry.
There's a review of the book, not Lolita, but Lolita in the Afterlife, on Book Page, and the reviewer, Robert Wiebezal, says that this collection, quote, wholly reassesses Lolita's legacy as our society grapples with the harm caused by white male privilege and the age-old propensity to look the other way. And that makes me think of what, Roxane, you and Victor were touching on about this handsome white man who so many times, and we see this a lot too in true crime and even just crime dramas, where the main character is this handsome white man, oftentimes wealthy, and it's almost like the audience doesn't want to believe that he could be evil because we've been indoctrinated. And so that review really resonated with me, and I would love to hear your thoughts on not only this collection in a quote unquote post Me Too society, even though we're still living in it, but the Me Too movement is happening. And someone actually even asked in the chat, how do you think that Lolita would have been received in today's times in light of the Me Too movement, and especially in light of all these things like race and male power and age? I mean, there's so much to unpack here. We could go on for 3 hours, but I would love to dive deeper into that.
Well, I'll dive in then for the moment and say I do think one of the things that, because there is this question often about how would Lolita live now, like how could it exist now, what would happen now, that kind of thing. And I think the thing that's often overlooked is how purposeful Nabokov is in seeding the book with criticism of Humbert. The whole point is you're never supposed to think that his opinion of himself and what he's doing is accurate, right? Or is in any way sort of being lauded, right? You luxuriate in the way he luxuriates in his power with language and his power over Lolita and his power over Lolita's mother, all the rest. But I don't think, the book I often associate with this as almost like the mirror opposite is American Psycho, and feeling like American Psycho is Lolita without the feeling that the author understands as explicitly. Like, I mean, I know he said in the past, Ellis has said in the past, Bracey Nelson said in the past, that it is a sort of satire / critique of that sort of 80s kind of guy. But I only believe that about half, right? I do think it's also kind of a celebration of that guy. And only toward the end does it sort of fall apart in a sort of way. But with Lolita, right from the start, as soon as Cheryl points out in that in the intro to the intro kind of thing, when you're told these basic details about what happened to Lolita and how things ended up, right from the start, Nabokov is seeding the idea that you shouldn't believe him, you know? And I think that's the thing that's often missing from people who have been like influenced by him or by this book, is that they don't get that way that he's doing this incredibly complicated critique of this person, even as you are embedded in this person. It's such a high wire act to pull off as a writer, and also to his credit, and to never drop it. Like, you know, there's not a point where he says, I mean, there's moments of, I suppose, regret, supposedly, here and there, but he never kind of comes back and be like, you know, I thought about it and it turns out I'm pretty lousy. And I agree that everybody is right and I'm wrong. Like, he doesn't do that. And I think a lot of writers, if they even tried this, would at a certain point try to say, don't blame me, it's just a book. But Lolita takes you all the way to the precipice and over it. And Nabokov does not blink in sort of making you have to be in this person, even as he's critiquing this person. I mean, it's just such an astounding sort of balancing act as a writer.
I think too that Erica Sanchez writes in her piece that it's his whiteness that lets Humbert get away with it for so long. You know, that if there was a person of color, if there was a girl crying and visibly upset and damaged, and there was a person of color whisking her around, he would have been pulled over immediately. There's
plenty of YouTube videos of exactly that. Of I can't remember it's a couple of years old now, but black dude who's a babysitter for like 2 white children, and the cops have just pulled him over because somebody just saw them like at a, whatever it might have been, a Target, a Kroger's, whatever it is, and they just said, well, I saw this black man taking these 2 children around. Obviously something's wrong. And then the police come and he starts taping it just to say, to basically cover himself. And he's explaining like, no, I'm the babysitter. And they're like, you can hear the cop is like, do you have proof of that? And he's like, well, yeah, here's their parents' number. He's like, that's not quite enough. You're like, what do you want? Like, what would be enough? And the answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing would be enough. You know, and whereas, Humbert taking those 2 kids around, sadly, nothing would be done, no matter, or taking Lolita around, right, would still be given free rein, more than likely.
Well, and I think too, like, there's no question that the culture, patriarchy, white supremacy were collaborators in this book. You know, in both the writing of the book, the fact that Humbert could move through the world without being questioned in those ways, it has everything to do with white supremacy and patriarchy. You know, the sort of power we grant white men, and really the power over female bodies specifically. You know, and I think that not only is that a collaborator within the world of the novel, but actually the way that the novel was released into the world, that it's kind of like, well, you know, it's actually as appalling as this is, as appalling as it is that this guy is doing this to this young girl, and actually more than one young girl. It's also familiar, right? You know, it's taboo to talk about adult men having sex with female children. only because we don't like to talk about it. It's not taboo because it doesn't happen all the time. And so he's writing actually about a commonplace experience that's everywhere, but secret. And I do think that the culture collaborates with Lolita in that way.
Roxane, I wanted to ask you right before I came on here. So I've just discovered Twitter for everyone else except for Roxane. I've been following for like 2 years, which is really all I need to follow on Twitter. I've decided, no offense to anybody else. But I just read your piece on cuties like right before I signed on. And I wanted to ask you about, you say that the poster for that, Cheryl was just talking about the bodies, girls' bodies, and that the poster of that, which featured 4 girls, the Netflix poster, not even the poster in France, right? Was 4 girls' bodies in seductive dance.
Yes.
And I just wanted to ask you about that, like in with Lolita, with the movie, they said it was the poster of the sunglasses, the heart-shaped sunglasses that aged her up in our mind and sort of destroyed Lolita in a whole nother way in the popular culture. And I just wanted to ask you about what you thought with the cuties of how she portrays the bodies versus how they showed them in the advertising.
Well, with Cuties, which is, for those of you who may not be familiar, it is actually a French film called Mignon that was directed by an incredibly talented French director named Maimouna Doucouré. And Netflix, for whatever reason, massively shit the bed and created a poster that showed the 4 girls at the heart of this movie in really sexualized poses with skimpy clothing and so on. And so, of course, there was an immediate backlash and a bunch of people decried the film without having seen it, as one does. And it turns out that the movie actually is a condemnation of the sexualization of children. It actually represents the very thing that so-called critics were railing against. And it was an interesting choice that Netflix made, in addition to being an appalling choice. It's like, you look at it and you have to wonder, who were they marketing the film to? Because it wasn't women, because women in general are not going to be lecherous to young girls. And so that lets you know that they thought that they should be marketing the film. They were trying to get men, and I would say heterosexual men, to watch this movie. And they thought that this was the way to do that because they assumed that their other audiences would be on board. And, whether it's Lolita or Cuties, we tend to fetishize young girls and their bodies. And I think we do so to their detriment, because one of the very points that the film makes is that there are consequences, and that a lot of times these young girls, they certainly have agency, but they don't know what they're doing sometimes when they mimic what they're seeing in videos and in fashion shoots and so on. Like, they understand the power of it, but they don't understand the repercussions of wielding the power of sexuality. And it's a lot to think about, but I think it's important for us to think about so that this doesn't happen again, because unfortunately, this is a film that would have, I think, been an Oscar contender were it not for this backlash. And so now this incredible director who wrote the movie also has people who didn't even see the movie, and she's going to be fine. She's going to work again. She's already working on her next project, but she did this project. And because of the way we sexualize girls, that project was not seen by nearly the audience it would have otherwise had.
True. Like I think about, first of all, why did we all age her up? Like, why did I read it and think Dolores was my age when I was 18, when she was 12? And right. I think part of that, and Sloane Crosley touches on this in her piece, is part of that is that these films sexualized Lolita. They aged up the actresses. They made them all 15. Sue Lyon and Dominique Swain. They were 15, not 12. They had blonde hair, not brunettes, right? And so then I think it's a different story. And then Lolita in the novel, I thought of what you wrote too, because Lolita in the novel is she's flirting with her changing body. I mean, she wants to be a movie star. She, according to Humbert, of course, but she wants to be a movie star. She goes to kiss him in a movie star way. She's always listening. She buys all the movie magazines. But she's still a girl.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things about the book and the discourse around it is that people tend to forget that she has every right to do those things. And instead it becomes, how do these things affect men? As if men are these just sad little weak creatures who can't control themselves. Well, I mean,
Like Robert Long, right? Like he was.
it is what it is.
Robert.
But you know, it takes away agency from everyone, because it just makes men susceptible only to their desires and unable to control themselves. And it makes Lolita seem like she's a minx, a coquette, just a nymphette, as he loves to call her, Humbert. You know, I think it just puts young women in an incredibly untenable position of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because if she wasn't discovering her body and its power and her sexuality, she would probably be criticized for being frigid.
Welcome, Alex. Alex, I wanted you to tell everyone just a little bit about your piece in the collection, especially because, you know, Lolita is one of the top books that has been banned from schools and libraries and reading lists for decades. And your piece touches a little bit on the censorship of literature, and Lolita feels like it's a prime case study. I even remember a professor of mine, I was an undergrad in the mid 2000s, and saying that even faculty in the English department at the liberal arts college that I went to had decided against ever teaching Lolita. It was just, they had made a point, like, I just will never teach it. And he had said, that makes me want to teach it to you all even more, because I want to make sure you read it. But I would love for you to talk about your piece in the book.
Sure. Thank you. So my essay in the book, the inspiration for it was simply that I had tried over the years to read this book, and would always get about 4 chapters in and stop. And the kind of strange thing to me when I finally did sit down with the book with the determination to really this time get all the way through was realizing like how much those 4 chapters had become a kind of literary influence because of how often I had reread them over and over. And that was that was its own fascinating realization. But then, you know, once I did get into the book, I thought, oh my God, this is what you all have been talking about all this time. And I realized that I had been kind of, like a lot of people perhaps, faking my way through certain conversations around the book or about the book by acting as if, like, of course I supported the book's right to exist. Of course I understood the value of it inside of the, you know, literary critical industrial complex. There is a fantastic amount of scholarship about the unreliable narrator that has come up around the novel that we would not have without it. But at the same time, we can see that, you know, this is one of those books where it has an impact way past the sort of perimeter of the novel, where it, you know, Lolita has become a kind of figure that I think of as like a fictional celebrity, like someone who's never existed, that everybody knows about in a sort of popular way that may or may not have anything to do with the novel itself. And, you know, Dracula is like that, Anna Karenina is like that. You know, you have a kind of idea of them in your head, and the writer as a result becomes a sort of influence on the culture, even if you've never read the novel. This is a really strange cultural space that you enter into with figures like that. And I think, you know, you were talking just now about like how that has worked on generations of young women to sort of effectively validate this this aging up of young women, the way that they're treated. You know, just when you were talking about cuties, I was thinking about a moment on vacation with my family when my sister turned 12 and came down to the pool in a bathing suit, and I realized, watching the men around the pool watch her, how her life had already changed just at age 12, and how she looked older. She was taller. There's a novel called One Pill Makes You Smaller that's about this kind of experience for young women. The where you're a girl, but the world is treating you like a woman because your body looks like an adult woman. You're in this kind of trap, you know. And I remember watching on that same trip as men would make animal noises at my sister in front of me. And I, you know, when I asked her about it, she said it's worse when you're not around. And I just thought, like, wow, being a woman is hell. And it starts when you're a girl, and it just keeps going. So finally reading the novel, I suppose, was like an insight into that experience from the other side. I think I described it as feeling like I was soaked in Humbert's hair oil by the end of it.
You said you felt shoved into Humbert's armpit.
Yes. Not in the good way. And you know, it just was at one point I had to get the audiobook, and just because I could not keep reading it. So the way that I read it, quote unquote, was to listen to Jeremy Irons read it to me, which was its own terrifying experience, because of course, in many ways that did not make any of it easier or better to get through. I think the thing that startled me the most was how, in the end, what I saw that Humbert desired was not her, but her as powerless. She had to be unmoving. She had to be only a receptacle for his fantasies and not at all participatory. She couldn't, as much as he talks about delighting in her touches in the early sections, by the time they run away, he's drugging her. He doesn't want her to move at all. The fantasy is about having access to that, which is terrifying.
Someone just wrote in the comments, in relation to what you just said, that a 12-year-old's body is now like a woman's. It is only the male gaze that makes it so.
Yes.
Yeah. And we talked about that too, we're getting Humbert's point of view the entire time. And so unreliable narrator, we can't trust anything he says, that Lolita is in fact flirting with him, seducing him. This is all written through a psychotic male gaze. And I think when I read it for the first time, I was an undergrad. I was in my probably early 20s, but I remember also just the pure prose of it, just the writing and the techniques, and how we could stick with this unreliable, hateable, despicable narrator for hundreds and hundreds of pages, which is a testament to the strength of the writing, because you hate this person, but you are with him for hours and hours. And there's some great questions from the audience that are coming in, and some of them are asking you guys, because a lot of you are teachers now. And if you were to teach this book, or if you have taught this book, how would the reading and the teaching of it today, how would today's society, I mean, things are very different from 1958. And so how would the things that are happening today influence your teaching of the book?
I think that a lot of times when people talk about this book, they only do so in reverential tones. and they talk about what a masterpiece it is. And I do think it is one, but I also think that it is something that is an account of a really repulsive thing. And I think that's important. You know, I think a lot of times people want to set aside what this book is actually about and the cultural context that makes a narrative like this possible at the altar of great writing and genius. And that's not necessary. And so I think it's important to bring the book back down to earth and teach it here on earth and not in some sort of vaulted echelon of literary greatness. Because when you do that, what you're telling students is that literary greatness is more important than trauma. It's more important than the safety of young women. It's more important than the ways in which our culture overly sexualizes young girls, such that Alex's sister, you know, like he sees the moment when she goes from being a girl to a woman, where her life changes. And, you know, like we have to talk about that. And I think we also have to talk about artistic responsibility and what kinds of responsibilities do we have. One of the things I write in my essay is that it's so beautifully written that it makes something really horrifying seductive. And I think that's really dangerous. I think that it will allow a lot of really horrible people to feel justified in doing really horrible things.
Yeah, I think I would probably teach it in like as a part of if I were to teach it ever, I would teach it within a continuum of books, like the one that I mentioned by Lisa Dearback, for example, like a novel that I mentioned in my essay, Agostino, which is a short Italian novel. I think I would teach it alongside the scholarship that I was talking about in relationship to the unreliable narrator. I would ask students to think about what is being satirized, if this is a satire. And I would probably approach it that way, but it does seem like one of those books where I don't know that I would teach that course every year, if you understand me. I think that would be the kind of thing, like maybe I would bring it out every 4 years in departmental rotation. So
I would agree with both those ways of thinking about the book, and I would just add, like, at least in my experience of teaching literature, great literature, whatever that means, like nothing kills, at least in my experience, a love or an interest in a book more than saying that you can't like argue about the book, that you only have to love the book. There's been a number of books that I've taught. They're not like Lolita exactly, except that they are classics. I'm thinking of like Song of Solomon, and I'm thinking of Moby Dick, a couple other things where some of the best conversations we had were when the room was a safe space to argue about why these books got so deep into a reader. And then my job as the teacher was to say, that's not a magic trick, that's the art of this book. The way that the writer wrote it, the way that they put things in the order they did, the way they let you in and then kept you out, that was all designed. So let's talk about if this thing affected you, if it made you feel something, that was a skill. That was something someone did. So now let's talk about how or why. But I find if the worst thing is if we've all read a book and everybody kind of goes, it was fine. And they go, oh, we're not gonna have a good class. I shouldn't teach this book again. But if it gets at them in some sort of way, then there's at least a chance for healthy discussion, but more importantly, healthy argument to let particularly those people who say, like, I hate this book, and say, okay, let's talk about why, and let's talk about how is that on purpose, or is the author seem to be unaware? And the fun is sometimes it's on purpose, and they go, oh, okay, well, what was the reason for doing that? And then we start to get into these deeper conversations about how art can sort of hit our nerves in certain ways that is meant to inspire thought, versus the the stuff that just sort of feels provocative simply to sort of get a rise out of it is just trolling.
Shock value.
You know, and then you sort of feel like, well, we're not going to read that again, you know.
And Jim Shepard said in this book, because he was the person who taught it to me all those years ago and wrote a piece in here. And Jim Shepard said if he was teaching it today, he would never lose sight of the girl at its center. You know, Vera, when you go back when it was first published and everyone's writing about what a brat Lolita is and she's spoiled, and Vera was the one who said, you know, why isn't anyone feeling sorry for Lolita? Why isn't anyone noticing this hopeless child? And Jim Shepard, looking at it today, says you can't teach this book without putting her right in the middle, the center of the conversation, even if Nabokov left her out.
Yeah, it's like I said earlier, I think that the culture was absolutely a collaborator in the book. And, you know, we have to remember that the way that it's only very, 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 very recently that I would say people have come upon the idea that maybe the victim of sexual violence wasn't asking for it. Like, this is a new concept in our culture, I'm so sad to say. And there is no way to imagine Lolita having not been asking for it for a lot of readers until pretty recently. And so, you know, I think that flipping the narrative, like flipping the way we interpret the book on its head would be, I don't know that I would teach the book. I love the book. I think it's a brilliant book, but like I'm with Alexander, I think it's a very problematic book to bring into a classroom when you have, you know, there's a lot going on that could go wrong, you know, but I would really focus on that, putting her at the center in ways that we haven't for decades.
Someone asked that too, and Cheryl, you kind of preemptively answered it, is why the perspective of the offender and not the victim was chosen. And yeah, it was written in the 1950s. I think is one of the answers to that.
And white men were the protagonist.
Right.
They were and you know, it's also not, one thing that's really disturbing about the book to me is that it is read as sexy. And the victim's story is not a sexy one.
Absolutely. There's a question here and I think I've lost it. This kind of goes to what you guys were saying nicely. This person says, stories have power to create empathy and understanding. What do we owe to the main character of Lolita? Which I'm assuming they're saying is Dolores, not Humbert.
Well, what I want to say is I do think that the thing that saves Lolita the most for me is what I was going to say is what we owe to Lolita is a careful reading. If you read the book carefully, actually, Humbert is not, we aren't really rooting for him. He is a monster. It's very subtle. It's very discreet. I was going to say this too about teaching it. It would be, I think, a masterclass in close reading. You know, not just kind of looking at the story in a general sense or seeing the movie poster with the sexy sunglasses and the cute girl, and actually looking at the words on the page and what is the author saying about this character. He wants you to sympathize with a monster, and we do, and to some extent, to a range of, you know, a variety of extents, right? He wants us to read the rape of Lolita as a victory, as something that we've been waiting for all this time, like him. And I think that what we owe her is that careful reading that Nabokov says, no, this isn't, we aren't rooting for him. He is a monster.
I think it would be interesting, going back to the teaching idea, whatever, teaching the book, but then also both adaptations. And in a way, seeing, like, I would say how they are not close readings, you know, and like talking about the way that you can see both from the Kubrick one, then definitely to the I'm forgetting the director, Adrian Lin, is that his name? The Lin, just the way you can almost see, like, as time goes by, how they get farther and farther away from that close reading, and the disturbing way that when you lose those sentences, you lose the thing that is the only way you can understand, that Nabokov at least leaves the room for a thoughtful reader to be disturbed and disgusted, right? Whereas once you watch the films, at least as I watch the films, they bend over backwards to save Humbert, for lack of a better term, or perhaps to I guess to the point, to age up Lolita so much that it's taken out of the level of absolute monstrousness, which it should be. Like a version of a movie version where she was 12, you couldn't watch it. You just couldn't watch. I couldn't watch it, certainly. And it would be a way to almost like read the book, then you watch the movies, then come back to the book and be like, I guess this should just be a book, right? And like nothing else.
This question is interesting because there is a lot of juxtaposition in the novel between like lightness and darkness. And this Ryan says, I was wondering whether you had anything to say about the use of humor in the novel. Does it encourage us, the reader, to laugh at Humbert? Does it challenge us to resist laughing with him? Does it have a negative and dangerous effect of trivializing the sexual violence and trauma at the heart of the book?
Well, I think just like in the films that Lolita isn't 12, humor in this book, I mean, we're supposed to, I think, if you're a right-minded individual, you're supposed to laugh at Humbert. But I think humor makes him more charming. It makes him more affable, like, shucks, it's just that perv over there. And it's so much more grave than that. One of the things that rarely gets talked about when Lolita is talked about is that, in fact, the novel does show, as unreliable as Humbert is, that Dolores's life is basically ruined. And then he softens the ground for other predators to come in and also ruin her life. And humor makes that tolerable. It's I use this phrase too much, but it is the spoonful of sugar that makes the medicine go down, that makes us sort of just like marvel at the writing instead of what the writing represents. And so, it's there, but I do think it's something that we have to interrogate because it's doing something, but I don't know that it's doing something healthy.
I think it's always good to ask yourself, like, who is the joke on? As you're feeling the impulse to engage with the joke, who is the joke for? And that can tell you a lot about how the joke is pulling you around. I mean, jokes in a narrative, depending on the kind of joke, jokes can be the shortest form of narrative, so they can operate as like a tiny story within the story. Jokes are ways of introducing aggression that you're trying to mask, barely. Jokes can be a way of focusing the reader in on what is uncomfortable in the narrative, even by heightening what is uncomfortable. And so it's a really prismatic tool for a writer. Like, there's lots of ways that it can operate inside of a story, and I do feel like Humbert's jokes are, I mean, he's not particularly funny. He is miserable, and he's constantly complaining, even though everybody is going out of their way to do shit for him. He is just never happy with it. And there's this, it's exhausting. I'm sorry. Anyway, yeah, great book.
One thing I was going to say is how Victor and Andre Dubus come to the exact same line at the end, which is, I'm thinking of oryx and angels, the secret of durable pigments, prophetic sonnets, the refuge of art. And this is the only immortality you and I may share, my Lolita. And there's Victor saying, this is as chilling an ending as I can imagine in literature. The child will never be free. Humbert wins in every sense of the term that would satisfy his hideous heart. Humbert wins. Such men often do. Nabokov offers no reprieve. Talk about horror. And then Andre Dubus reads it, same line. It just breaks him in two. It breaks him open. He talks about melting, you know, like his ice heart broken open by this hero that he hated, you know, not even hero, protagonist that he hated, but it got to him. And I think in the cool thing about, this is my job to sell this book, but the cool thing about Lolita in the Afterlife, I'm serious, you guys, is that it goes back and forth. Like I would read one essay and then I'd say like, burn this forever. And then I'd read the next one and my heart would be pounding. I mean, it's so subjective. Like people have crazy different emotions to the same book. Was like astonishing to me.
Well, and you did such a good job too, Jenny, of collecting such a diverse group of writers. And I mean that in every sense of the word. And so you get so many different perspectives in this book. I mean, you're getting so many different types of people from different backgrounds and experience levels. And so there is, you know, I think I said in the review that I read that it is this fully whole analysis of the book from so many different points of view.
Well, and like Jessica Shattuck, she does what Cheryl does for Lolita, for Dolores, giving her voice. Jessica Shattuck realized that there's this one throwaway line Humbert says, you know, in parentheses, that Charlotte had lost a son. You know, that's how much room he gives her. He gives her a parentheses. She lost her child. And so Jessica comes in, and in the same way she gives Charlotte, who is Lolita's mother, her voice again, and writes a story about her. And she is so angry. She's like this crazy, outraged ghost. You know, how did you do this to me? And this, the most recent time when I read this book, I read it like a mother, right? I read it like, you know, I just wanted to jump into the book and save her.
I think that's a very normal reaction that probably most of us, or you hope that most readers have.
Well, and also I mean, as somebody who's written a lot about being a motherless daughter, so much of my piece also was, you know, a reflection of, we have to remember that Dolores was a motherless daughter. I mean, Humbert was responsible for, of course, killing her mother. And in the book, it was treated as if like, you know, this was like a happy thing that the bitch was dead. But of course, it was a devastating loss for Dolores that was never, ever really, I mean, she never was allowed to even acknowledge that. And yet so much of the story of her adolescence was that, like, you know, living in mother loss.
Sadly, we are out of time, even though I could hear you guys talk about this for days. I've dropped a link in the chat where you can purchase the book from Politics and Prose. I'll drop it again now really quickly. Definitely go buy this book. Like I said, this is such a whole and complete and interesting analysis of not only the book, but of society as a whole, of the male gaze, of white male privilege. There's just so much in there. And I hope you guys will all check it out. And to all of you, thank you so much. This was absolutely incredible to have you all on the same screen. And dare I say, it makes me thankful for Zoom events. I'll curse myself for saying that in the morning, but thank you so much for taking time to do this with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was great to see everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Indeed.
And Jenny, thanks for making this book. And
Oh, thank you guys for contributing. I'm so grateful and just overwhelmed. You guys are awesome.
One answer to the question of how to teach this book is to use this anthology.
There you go.
Oh, and
That's a great answer, Alex.
your writing is so beautiful, right? Like your writing is so beautiful that I feel like this book is art itself. Like, you know, Lolita, okay, but these are the new
We banded together and we're better than them.
We're better than him.
these are the new voices.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all for joining in tonight. And I hope you all stay well, stay safe, and stay well read.
Good night, everybody.